as well as the process the state will follow to distribute the American Rescue Plan Act dollars. So a couple of housekeeping issues before I begin our conversation with Senator Stinner. Today's webinar, as you just heard, is being recorded. Video of the webinar will be distributed on our listserv and posted on our website in the coming days. Attendees will be on mute the entire time. And if you have questions, please type them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen at any time. Please limit your questions to 2 so that we can have as many people as possible, give them the opportunity to ask questions. And we're going to begin by asking Senator Stinner several prepared questions, and then we'll turn it over to audience questions, and we'll do our best to get as many answered as possible. So with that, Senator Stinner, do you want to start off by telling us a little bit about the forecast and sort of the lay of the land in terms of the forecast and the budget as you're thinking about the upcoming session?
Yeah, thank you, Renee. I appreciate being here, and thank you very much for having me. I almost feel like I need to apologize right off the bat. This is going to be numbers oriented and a little wonky. I do want to start with 2021 and the results that actually did come in, because it's got a huge impact on the biennium budget and how we proceed from here. But I think everybody has seen the results. 4.7% increase in revenue is an historic number for the state of Nebraska. And a lot of people have asked me, you know, how much of that was due to stimulus, how much can we count on as we move forward? So one of the things that I've done is to take a look at over 37 years, 23 years of those 37 were up years. And that average was about 7.4% increase during that 37 years. So if I wanted to distill out and say, hey, if this was really an up year, agriculture is doing well, you take 14.7 from that, it's about 7%, take it times 35, take it times $5 billion in revenue, you got $350 million. The other way to look at it is say, what's our average? Our average now, I think, is about 4.5%. At least that's what we're using in fiscal, 4.7, 4.5, somewhere in there. So when you distill that, that's 10%. So that gives you a range of $350 to $500 million of what I would call extraordinary income. Now, what do we do with that extraordinary income? Well, interestingly enough, $535 million actually went into the rainy day fund, bringing that to $997 million. So we didn't squander that extra money, at least that first year. It gave us a buildup in the rainy day fund, which is an area where I've really kind of concentrated on trying to build that back up as a buffer, an economic buffer for us, but a one-time place where we take funds from. Think next program, $300 million is what we've committed to the University of Nebraska. So you really kind of want to start to think about those types of contingencies. Of course, there's a prison situation. We actually put $115 million for prison reform and a replacement for prisons or a new prison. We allocated some money for that, or appropriated some money for that, but allocated and basically sequestering the money until certain things are done, which was contained in that bill. But what this buildup has allowed us to do, really, from a session standpoint, is property tax relief. Property tax relief went from 125 million, which was our baseline number on 1107, to 548 million. That's a buildup of over $400 million in property tax relief related to income tax. We also, as a committee, allocated $63 million over the biennium, bringing a $275 million credit to $313 million. We also did tax relief as it related to Social Security, military pay. We had corporate tax. We started to scale down and try to bring that into parity. Those were significant items from the tax side of things. So that allowed us to get that done. The other thing is, obviously, I said 115 million is what we allocated for prisons. We had some other initiatives embedded into that. 2% for provider rates is about 90 million. We also were able to hold the appropriation expenditures down over a 2-year average to 2%. So that gave us a little extra room to do some of the things that I just briefed you on. So we checked a lot of boxes in the last session. We got a lot of stuff done. There were some economic development initiatives, some education initiatives, those types of things that we took care of. But historically, what has happened, if you look back at the charts, when you have a big up year like we just had, it's generally followed by a negative year or two. And it's just because you built the base up and you deal with averages, and that those things have to work out. So interestingly, in this forecast, the 475 and 425, we actually have a 2.9% increase and a 3.2% increase, not negative, but it really demonstrates the carryover of stimulus as it relates to the biennium. And whether that's enough or whether it isn't enough, I think we got to remember that these are estimates and forecasts are estimates. So what I want to do is to try to validate what that estimate actually looks like. And Tom Berquist actually provided an interesting, page 7, he sent out to the senators, and it's the relative magnitude of the Fed COVID assistance. And this also validates what the stimulus has done. And actually it's the CARES Act, Consolidated Appropriations Act, American Rescue Act, et cetera. $21.2 billion came into the state. Compare and contrast that to the total of personal income of $105 trillion. You got a 20%, 20.1% impact as it relates to personal income in the state of Nebraska. Huge number. We're still trying to digest what that all means and how it distills out. I don't know if we really have a refined number, but we know what the effect was, an historical 14.7 this year. And obviously then a carryover into the next biennium that gives us plus revenue growth as opposed to negative revenue growth. So one has to ask, where's it coming from? And I get that question a lot of times. And I actually got October's numbers. These are not official numbers. I'm going to give you what I pulled off of what fiscal sent to me. Actually, October had an up forecast over the estimated of $28.2 million. 14.4 million was out of sales tax. I use sales tax as kind of a leading indicator. It kind of gives us more of a trend analysis. It's about a month behind in its numbers. It was up 8.5% over the estimates. So, you know, what I'm saying is there's probably a good trend in there to continue on. When I look at, you know, the first 4 months, we're 184 million over what we estimated we would be. That's $46 million per month. And if you take that times 12, you're well over 552 million if that's what we average. Obviously, we're not going to average that, maybe more, maybe less, but that also validates what forecasting put in as the 475. So is it a good number? Isn't it a good number? The other way to look at it is to take the 475 from what we've done already, the 185, and you got 291 million. So what we would have to average to get to the forecast number of 475 is about $36.4 million a month, which appears to be doable. Trends are positive. So does that mean that we can use all of these numbers? Again, it's an estimate. Again, I have to caution you too that in February we have another forecasting board meeting. This is usually usually in February it's a tweak of the numbers. Given where we're at today with stimulus and all the other intangibles that are out there, you know, we don't know what's going to be, but we'll have another forecast, I guess is what I'm going to say. And what it all distills down to is what has happened from a fiscal status point with the forecast. $475.4 million increase in 21-22, increased revenue to 2.9%. Interestingly, that doesn't hit the threshold of 3.5, which is an 1107. So if we hit that number of 475, that all goes by law into the rainy day fund. And that would bring the rainy day fund to $1,473,000,000. That's a big number. Obviously, then the next year, it's a 3.2% increase, still under. But when we started the fiscal forecast, we were $101 million, $101.6 million negative, short of making the 3% minimum reserve. We are $313.5 million over that. And that means that that is what initially we'll bring to the floor. Again, there's a February forecast in between. There may be some adjustments. The other thing is we've got probably some deficit requests that we will have to deal with from agencies. I think everybody understands the administration has increased salaries and wages to attract and retain people. Certainly corrections has to be dealt with. There is a number there. The reason I don't know what that number is, I could tell you that it's about a $70 million number in terms of wages, but I don't know how much vacancy savings is in there that will carry over into that deficit request and make it as a smaller number. The other thing that we're going to deal with in this session and talk about probably at length, if indeed the state logic was that we can't attract and retain, that leaves providers as a question. And if you remember, 2% provider rate over a biennium is about a $90 million number. I've already talked to several providers. DD certainly is one of those. Child welfare is another one. Agencies and providers coming and saying, hey, $13, $14, $15 an hour, we can't retain people at that. We are under competitive pressures, those types of things. So the 2 and 3% may not work. We may have to build a base up similar to what we're doing within that wage increase within the state. We are mandated by law and federal mandate to provide a certain amount of services. And that means that we have to have manpower out there to deliver those services. Otherwise, we get fined by the CMS. That's our overseer. So that's something that maybe we'll deal a little bit with. Maybe we can deal a little bit with it with ARPA funds, maybe a dab here and a dab there. But it's something I think long-term, the legislature needs to be aware of, that inflation and what it's going to do just with the operations of the state of Nebraska. So that'll be a subject that I intend on talking about on the floor and certainly with the committee.
Senator Stinner, can I just stop you 1 second? That was a lot of information. I want to ask a couple clarifying questions, if you don't mind. Okay, so you mentioned, so the forecast was raised $475 million in this current fiscal year. Now, obviously you said that was an estimate, right? It's a forecast, it's an estimate. So a couple of things. You mentioned that assuming that revenue growth is less than 3.5%, then the entire amount of that surplus would go into the cash reserve. So question for you though, with these deficit requests, then would those reduce the amount that would go into the cash reserve, or would that be dealt with using revenue from year 2 of the
It'd be using revenue. Yeah, we do a biennium budget, so it's 2 years. Mm-hmm. We could possibly do is $300 million in adjustments without affecting the 475.
So it would be the full 475 would go into the cash reserve, and it would be the revenue
if that indeed comes in. Yeah.
Okay. And then just to clarify too, so you alluded to the 1107 credit, and you mentioned that if it's, if revenue growth is expected to be less than 3.5% over the prior fiscal year, can you explain what happens if it ends up that the forecast is still too low, and revenue ends up actually being greater than 3.5%? Then what will happen?
Everything above 3.5% would go into property tax relief at this point, because you've hit that threshold of 500 million that we put into. You had to get to the rainy day fund up to 500. Once it gets to 500, 3.5% over, everything goes to property tax relief.
Okay, great, thank you. And then there's the forecast raised, or the Economic Forecasting Board raised the forecast for the second year of the biennium to 427 million. But you indicated there will be those deficit requests. Do you have any sort of estimate yet? There was a projected shortfall as well coming into this forecast. Any idea what that would look like for the floor yet?
I am going to guess at least 200 million will be the floor. Now, do you want to use it for bills or actual bills, spending bills or tax or whatever? That's up to the legislature. But my guess is deficit requests potentially could be in that 50 million to 100 million range. And I do not know at this point because I won't know until like December. And that's just a guess. And again, we have vacancy savings that are carrying over into those brackets. I don't know what the effect of that's going to be.
Right.
And of course, we have and we have lapses and a few other things that that will impact the cash reserve.
Sure.
The minimum cash reserve.
Right. And then, of course, the February forecast, as you mentioned,
Yes.
will come into play as well. Okay. So did you have anything else that you wanted to mention on the budget or the forecast before I ask a couple more questions?
Well, one of the things is that happened in this forecast is we got our first 2023-24 forecast as well, and that was up 272. What that did is actually correct a structural imbalance. So now we're structurally balanced. That's something that I'm very sensitive about, is maintaining structural balance where, at least your checkbook balances so you don't have deficits and you're actually reducing. So that did correct that situation, and we'll see how this all plays out.
Great. So you mentioned earlier that I think the fiscal office estimated about 21 billion that's coming into the state, or about 20% of income, right? So really, really big amount that has been coming into the state or is going to come into the state in a very short period of time due to CARES and ARPA. Do you know how much of the improved forecast you would attribute to those federal stimulus programs?
Well, I'm sure that when the forecasting board started to put their numbers together, I'm sure that was contemplated. I don't know. I wasn't at that meeting. I don't know what the conversation was, but based on what I see, the forecasting board was contemplating some of that stimulus, and indeed should have, because it is coming in and it is going to have an effect, and there will be a carryover. And 2% unemployment plays into it as well.
Right. And at the forecasting board meeting, I think they all recognized that a large part of this, of our revenue being so strong, was due to the federal funding. But I don't think anyone's figured out how much of that is really due to the stimulus funds. But certainly that 21 billion is just a huge number to be thinking about in that way. I think that the fiscal office also mentioned that that's all state and local revenue for a 2-year period of time is another way to look at that number and how big that number is. So certainly it's having an impact. I think the $1 million or $1 billion question is how much. So what guidelines would you suggest the legislature follow when determining how to use about that 200 million that will be on the floor?
Well, and I think the discussion has to be, as we look to providers or what the needs are of the state, what programs are out there and what initiatives are. I don't know if the governor's going to have an initiative. Obviously, there's talk of tax relief as well. I just would put up a cautionary note that we don't know how this is all going to play out. However, we do know that, or feel that, we've got a fairly robust cash reserve, rainy day fund. So there is a buffer there. There is something to be said that we have provided that cushion.
Great. So what does that, I mean, I think you sort of answered this, but I'm going to ask maybe more directly. So there is talk about doing further tax cuts. What are your thoughts about using those surplus dollars for sort of ongoing tax cuts?
Ongoing, whether they be tax cuts or whether they be new programs or additions to, is ongoing. So I'm going to have to say that if I'm the only legislator out there right now and it's 200 million, I'm looking more toward one-time distributions into programs that can use it over a period of time. And I would say that with ARPA funds, there is technology, there is broadband, there is a whole bunch of things that come to mind that maybe one time we could refresh an intern program with additional dollars, for an example, to carry over for a period of time without really encumbering, long-term revenue. So but like I said, I'm only one of 49. So what we have to do in appropriation is to allocate and to bring to the floor as much money as possible.
And is your caution there because we really just don't have a good handle in terms of how much of the surplus revenue is from federal stimulus, which will at some point end, right? Versus our, due to the strength of our economy.
Right, and I think you can see it in 0.7 and 0.7 of revenue growth in what we call the out years. There it's pretty level. So as this starts to taper off, you really don't have a big cushion. So if inflation does take over, for an example, instead of holding the budget to 2 and 3%, it ends up being a 4% or a 5% adjustment that brings your base up. You're gonna have encumbered a revenue flow over some period of time. You may need some rainy day funds to bridge you for a period of time till that 4.5% revenue growth catches up.
And would you expect to see that in terms of some of those salary increases that you talked about as well? What ends up being the longer term impact of that?
Well, when you bring the base up, and I know that the Federal Reserve's talking about transitory inflation, but when it has to deal with wages and you bring the wage base up, you're not going to reduce that wage base when inflation actually becomes transitory. That is a permanent increase. It's a permanent base increase. You have to contemplate that as you project out because your expense, your appropriation base just went up. So okay. Revenue, because we have to balance the budget, revenue has to match that.
Okay, great. We do have an audience question that I'm going to ask you before we talk a little bit more about ARPA. The question was, does property tax relief have to go to taxpayers or can it be sent directly to local governments? And this was in reference to the 1107 discussion.
1107 is taxpayer on the income tax. The tax credit fund, which is the 313, actually is forwarded to the counties for reimbursement. That's my understanding of it. Great.
Thank you. So let's talk about ARPA a little bit. So the legislature will have 1.168 billion in ARPA funds to distribute. Do you have an idea of what that process is going to look like to determine the priorities for appropriating those dollars?
Yeah, and a lot of this is guessing a little bit from just short conversations. I've had a few conversations with the administration, and right now they're a little bit vague. They're going to make a proposal. That proposal will come to the speaker. The proposal will be put into a bill, and then obviously it goes to the Appropriations Committee. What I've been trying to tell people is, if you have a request, go talk to the governor first, see if you can get it put into the proposal. The second thing would be to put it into an individual bill and actually have it ready so that you could present it to the appropriations bill, and then therefore we can put it into the proposal to the legislature. There may be other deviations from that, but I'm right now, I got lots of different lanes that I can go down, whether it's individual, whether it's a fairly comprehensive appropriations committee bill, or just how this is all going to come together. But if I was going to counsel somebody, talk to the governors first, make sure you're inside the guidelines, make sure it's a one-time spend. Those are the things that we're going to prioritize. The other thing that our committee's talked about, and I've talked a little bit to the governor about, is themes, economic development theme. Certainly there is a piece of this thing that has to deal with healthcare. That needs to be a theme. And so you start to work themes, and workforce obviously is another theme. So you start to work those themes out and allocate dollars, and it might be 4 or 5 different ideas within a theme to come up with those numbers. Now, what we have today is 520 million. We have to make application for the second 525 million. I think in talking to you, Renee, that's an April date to be filed. I have not heard that. I had heard January 1st, we're supposed to get the second half of the money. There is considerable concern that we won't get the second half. So as we put together numbers, the question becomes, does appropriation just appropriate what we have on hand, or do we appropriate the whole thing? My vision today would be appropriate what we have on hand, and then maybe a second tranche where if we get that money, this is how it would be spent. So
I see. So
maybe a contingency bill, if you will.
And I think after doing a little bit more research, we understand that that we would be eligible to receive that second tranche in May, which would be 12 months after the first tranche. So just a little follow up there. So, and just a little clear, so what you're sort of envisioning is that maybe so the legislature appropriates that first tranche and has sort of intent language for the second tranche, or says or maybe it's stronger than intent language, assuming that it's received, this is how it's distributed. Can you tell me a little bit more on that?
Or in talking to the speaker, he may just say, we'll do the 520 that we have on hand. And we'll hold back till we get the money for the 520 on the second, and it'll be handled by next session. When you have to spend the money within a 3-year period of time, I guess I would suggest to allocate all of it, get approval of the legislature on all of it, so that you're ready when those dollars actually come in and they can then be released.
And one other sort of process issue I'm going to go back a minute on. So you had suggested people have individual bills that are introduced. Would you envision that if it's a different subject matter, for example, let's just pick broadband, and maybe traditionally that might go to the transportation committee, will you try to have all of those bills go to appropriations so that the appropriations committee has those all in one place? Or
you're asking me a referencing question, and I'm going to be silent on that. How's that? It's up to the reference. It's up to exec to reference bills, and I'll wait and see how that all comes about.
Okay, fair enough. I was just trying to think logistically, if it ends up in an appropriations bill, what that process will be to make sure that there's that flow of information into appropriations. So let's see, are there any big ticket items you've heard about that look to tap the ARPA dollars? Anything that you think is really likely to be included?
Yeah, and I think you saw Senator McDonald's bill for not-for-profits. That was a request that went out, and it's 335 million. And who knows what we'll allocate as a committee, but that will be a fairly substantial. Star Wars obviously is out there. We'll see what the speaker has to that, and I don't have any information on Star Wars.
Can you just speak globally to what it is?
It's a project dealing with tourism and building an infrastructure or tourism attractions in 3 different parts of the state. That's what I understand it to be. Now, I'm not an
Just wanted-
authority. I haven't participated in any of that discussion, but that would be, that I think is contemplated to be some major number. So, and then there's the, Game and Parks are going to come with something. I'm sure it's going to be along the lines of improvements to the parks or deferred maintenance, those types of things. So those are one-time spends. Technology, do we want to really take a hard look at technology, study technology, try to build our technology up? That might be a spend that has some long-term implications, short-term money for long-term implications. Those would be areas. And again, you have workforce initiatives that I think have to be looked at favorably.
And so will all ARPA dollars be used for one-time projects versus short-term bumps in funding regular budget items? What's your vision there?
I guess people have asked me about pilot projects. Pilot projects are going to be very, very difficult to get through ARPA. First of all, you have to be in the guidance. So it has to be specifically within the guidance, has to be spent in 3 years. And one-time projects that have long-term implications, I think both the governor as well as myself are sensitive to starting new programs with our ARPA. That isn't what we're intending on doing. Now, that could change. Again, we got a legislature that's got 49 votes. So I'm just telling you from my perspective what we're going to look at. Then we bring our suggestion to the floor and everybody gets a bite of the apple.
And just to reiterate, and we did have a question in the chat too. So in terms of the 300 million in the second year of the biennium and ARPA, it sounds like you, at least Senator Stinner, chairman of Appropriations, are really looking predominantly at sort of one-time programs for that money. Is that right?
For ARPA, yes. We'll see what kind of bills we get for the general funds. There may be an expansion of existing programs. It might be more wage related. It might be provider related. It's hard to know that at this point. I just haven't heard a whole lot from other committee chairs about what the needs are.
Okay. So do you think social services, healthcare, and education projects should be a significant part of the ARPA state recovery appropriation?
I'd have to take a look at what you're talking about and on specific issues. Healthcare is one that we're going to take a hard look at in what we can do with one-time dollars. I know on the mental health side, we're taking a look at acute beds and expansion of capacity of acute beds. That's $243,000 per bed. How many beds can we allocate and what kind of program can we put together? And can we put it together in a very short period of time and get it spread throughout the state? That would be a question. Education gets a lot of money directly. So I know the university put in some proposals in the LR that look to be, have merit. I know community colleges, for one, have got a pretty good proposal as well to expand, basically expand brick and mortar type of things or equipment to expand a curriculum for workforce development. So those would be things on education that would be looking at favorably.
Great. All right, thank you. It looks like we've got several questions that have come in the chat, and most of them have to do with sort of the forecast versus ARPA. So I'm going to go back to that, and we may get some more ARPA questions. But the first question is, what are your thoughts about the 1107 credit being underutilized by taxpayers?
That kind of caught me a little bit flat-footed, $50 million. I just actually went in and talked to my accountant this morning. And I said, hey, did you put that in my tax return? And of course, we went through forms and they did make it a little bit easier where if somebody owns land in several different school districts, it isn't such an arduous task. we're going to have to get a handle on that. And we've got some time to do that. And like I said, I'm going to be asking a lot of questions about that. Is it late filers? Is it people that don't understand? Is it a tax form problem that we have where it isn't broken out on the tax form clear enough so people pick it up? I need to get a better feel for it.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see, so we had a question, is the FY22 forecast really not more than 3.5% increase over FY21? That was a request from the media.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
So is the it looks like someone in the media is surprised that the FY22 forecast isn't more than 3.5% over FY21.
It's 3.2%. Yeah, it stays under that threshold predominantly for the 4 years.
Okay. It does uptick, doesn't it uptick a little bit in FY?
It goes, 14.7 down to 2.9, up to 3.2, then to 0.7. Those are more guesses by us. As further out you get, the more that you're trying to fit it into that 4.5. So if you take, for an example, if you took these numbers and added them up, the 14.7, 2.9, 3.2, 0.7, 0.7, I think you come up to 22.2 or something like that. But if you took the 4.5% that we use in fiscal times 5 years, you're at 22.5. So that needs to come out about the same. And that's just how we work our numbers for the out years.
And can you explain, I'm familiar with the 4.5%, but I'm guessing that there are folks that are watching that aren't familiar with what you're referring to there.
Yeah, we were actually in the past using about a 5% rate, but we passed so many tax legislations that have pulled that number down. We're now in a position when you distill out what the forecasting board does and then put all of the tax legislation up against that, it comes out to about an average of 4.5% instead of 5%. And it's just the impact of bills that we've passed.
And just to clarify, so that's a number that you use based on historic revenue growth, right? To predict the out years. Yeah.
Right,
okay.
Right. I'm sorry. Yes, we use that. Actually, it's a 37-year or 40-year analysis of the ups and downs as it relates to, and there's a chart in the budget book that looks like a cardiogram, but actually when you distill it out, it's about a 4.5% average.
Yeah, and that's based on just regular economic cycles, and
they always refer to it as rate-based adjusted after forecast. So
okay, great. So another media question is the historic revenue increase that you referenced, 4.7% or 14.7%?
The one that we had in 2021, the one that we've actually incurred was 14.7% increase, annual increase in revenue over the year before. That is historically as high as we've ever had it.
And I think you said that was about double the highest point previously. Is that
just well? If we looked at all the up years on average, there's 23 up years on average. So you take that average, and it's about 7.4% increase. When you take a look at the 14, it's about So you'd add 7% to that, and you'd be right about on top of about double what historically we've seen in up years.
Okay, great, thank you. What are your thoughts on generational investments and things like mental health care access instead of building a new prison?
I'm 100% behind mental health and whatever we can do to improve our access and affordability. I've been a proponent of that since the day I kind of started as a senator, but the building of a prison is a replacement situation. The question that we have right now before us, and the press needs to understand this, is do you go back in, and the last time you renovated a 150-year-old plus prison was 1980. You got a 50-year useful life. Now we're going to have a study, an engineering study, to assert that indeed it's a 50-year average life, useful life. So once we get that, it'll validate that 50 years. We also have a facilities plan that's being prepared so that we can take a look at the facility plan. And what the facility plan will do is to take a look at any kind of reforms that we have, because right now on the prison side, we're having 150 to 200 more people showing up every year. Well, if you are going to build something and you're looking out 20 years, you're never going to catch up. We've actually built 800 beds, but they're all full because we have yet to pass any kind of legislation to basically bend that curve down. And that's really what Senator Lathrop, CJI, is working on, is a proposal there. So that's part of that reform, and we've allocated dollars for that reform. Now we take a look at facilities plan based on reforms, and we start to put together what fits the best. Do you want to throw $240 million at a renovated prison that's 150 years old? I can tell you I've renovated a lot of old buildings, and I can tell you the estimates are generally 10 to 20% off, because you always find a bearing wall, you always find a surprise that's going to cost you a heck of a lot of money. Or do you want to build something new that basically they're telling me is more efficient, will take less manpower somewhere else? That's the decision that you have. But you need to do it if the useful life is 50 years, is 2030. Building a prison will take you some time. The other situation that we've got to confront is manpower. We've got to be able to staff it. And right now, we are having a dickens of a time staffing it. So that's what the increase is about. That's what retention bonuses are about. I think the administration is trying to use every tool they can, every lever they can, but it's a difficult question right now from a manpower standpoint and a staffing standpoint. So,
and that question also made me think of another sort of ARPA question. So there are some restrictions, right, on how ARPA can be used. I'm not sure how clear it is about using ARPA dollars for something like a prison. I don't know what your thoughts are about that. And obviously, I know when we've talked before, you've shared concerns about if we use it, we need to make sure that we're using it for purposes that are allowed under the law. Otherwise, we may have to repay that. So anyway.
Yeah, I do not want to have a clawback, and I don't think anybody in the legislature, inclusive of the governor, wants to have a clawback. So we're going to be pretty careful. And, you know, many times what you do is you look at other states, well, they're using it for this. They might, but they may have to pay it back as well. So we want to be pretty clear about how we use the money to stay within the guidelines. One-time money for one-time dollars makes a lot of sense. But for a prison, you know, you've got the rainy day fund as one-time spends. You've got $300 and some million sitting in general fund excess, and possibly could be allocated. Some of those dollars could be allocated. So there are dollars available at this point in time, as opposed to maybe waiting when you don't have it. So the good part is we have the money to do it. The bad part is we have the money to do it. You know, it's just one of those.
Right. I was sort of thinking, when I was thinking about this webinar, I was reflecting on when you came in as appropriations chair and you had to deal right off the bat with this huge shortfall. And now in your final year, there's all of this money and the kind of polar opposite.
Yeah, we had to cut $1.2 billion out of a biennium budget. Now we're going to have $1 billion plus extra. So, I mean, how does that happen, obviously?
Right. I would think that this would be a little less painful than the shortfall, but nonetheless still a lot of work.
You know,
Right.
back to the prison situation, I think there's a lot of pieces that need to be put in place before we move ahead and start to appropriate money. We're taking this very seriously. I think the administration is as well, but there's going to be no rush. We're going to go and do our due diligence, and we're going to make sure that we're doing the right things with taxpayer dollars. So,
Great. Another question, what's the historic revenue percentage average decrease in the other 14 of the 37 years mentioned? Did you calculate that by chance?
I have it, but I've got to look it up. It's actually in the budget book, and if I can put my finger on it, I can probably give it to you pretty quickly. Oh boy. You'd think I'd have that memorized, wouldn't you? The average revenue decline below average revenue was 14 years, 1.4%.
Okay.
So it's still positive, but it's 1.4%. And usually it shows up in corporate. So.
Okay, interesting. Yep, we know that that's pretty volatile. So we had a question about the use of ARPA funds for broadband. I'm going to expand on that question a little bit because there's also potentially another bill that Congress has debated or could potentially pass, which I think has about 200 million in additional infrastructure dollars for Nebraska. How are you thinking about, you know, the other potential legislation out there, whether that would be used first for broadband should it pass, or whether you would be using ARPA, or whether you would be using surplus dollars? Have you given that much thought?
Well, what we're going to do is to take a look at what the legislation says. The one thing about the infrastructure, you know, Congress can allocate all this money they want to bridges and roads and broadband and all of that. Do we have the manpower to build it? That's the biggest question I have right now. Sure, you could send us a check for 200 million and say, build broadband or build a road or build bridges, but do we have the manpower to get there? And do you give us enough time? Is it going to be over a 3-year period of time? We got to spend it. Is it going to be over a 5-year or a 10-year period of time? Those are questions I have, and I can't answer your broadband question, but you know, we did use some CARES Act money for broadband, allocated 50 million. I think we spent 29, simply because we didn't have the staffing out there, the workforce out there. So yeah, we're committed to broadband. We're committed to making sure that everybody has good broadband, quality broadband. But you know, the universal service funds there also contributing along with these extra dollars. Hopefully we can get there in a very short period of time. But again, it's a matter of function of workforce and manpower. And now we're going to be competing from state to state for manpower on the construction side. So I don't know what those guys are doing. Do you, Renee?
Yeah, they're going to be making a lot of money. So we had a couple of questions. One, obviously you have a lot of, you have extensive institutional knowledge that you have built up while you've been appropriations chair, and which we've been really grateful to have you in that leadership role during both good times and rough times. And so there is that sort of acknowledgement and a question about whether you have any words of wisdom for future appropriations chairs.
You know, the one thing that I have learned is this is takes a lot of hours. It takes a heck of a commitment. So you do have to go into it wanting to learn as much as you possibly can, as fast as you possibly can. I guess being intellectually curious. The other thing that I'm mindful of is I've got a very, very experienced committee. Now, Mark Coulterman, myself, and Senator Hilkeman are leaving, so that's 3. But you've got very, very capable people that have been around through cuts along with the good times right now. So you got a capable staff, you got a good fiscal office, rebuilt fiscal office, and continuing to be rebuilt as we speak. But those elements will play out very well. And I know I'm leaving it in very capable hands. My vice chair, Anna Wishart's done a great job as a vice chair. She's basically taken the lead in the ARPA funds and has taken $2 billion of requests we had in our LRs and distilling those down into notes. So those are things that we're going to use, the resources we're going to use. So, but the state with the $1 billion+ in rainy day fund is in pretty decent shape.
Great. Yeah. And I would reiterate, we've really appreciated Senator Wishart's leadership on the committee, as well as particularly with the ARPA funding and Senator Kavanaugh as well, and pulling the hearings together, and looking forward to that conversation next session too. So we have another question. Would you support using ARPA funds to invest in a statewide data collection system to better address food security issues in our state?
I would probably look pretty favorable. It sounds like it's one-time money, setting up a system. That's kind of what we're looking to do.
Yeah, so those one-time expenses that really can help us address issues in a sort of a transformational or long-term way is what you're really looking for.
Yeah, and what we'd have to assess is it going to be additional operating funds to continue? That would have to be looked at as part of that.
Another question that I have, in terms of that, what are your thoughts on projects that might have an initial investment, like the example that was just given with the statewide data collection system to address food security issues? Has there been any thought, or what is your thought about proposals that come to you that may have an initial investment, but then there's that sort of public-private partnership where there are private dollars that are committed to continue, to fund those expenses, any remaining expenses on a longer term?
Yeah, and that's a good question, and it's one that has been posed to me a couple times. And what we'd have to do is see what those dollars are, and can we find a place within, say, general funds or a cash account that keeps it out of general funds in order to run the program. So we'd have to assess it, do some due diligence on it. Obviously, if it's a big number and it's a general funds number, how important is it to the state of Nebraska? Those types of things. But I'm going to try to stick to making sure it's one-time funds and, stay within the guidelines and make sure it's spent in 3 years, and so we don't trip ourselves up. But again, I'm just one of 49. I will tell you that, and my committee may have some ideas, and we'll try to vet those in committee and then bring it to the legislature, to the floor, and then of course the governor will have his opportunity to agree or disagree.
Okay, great. So I think we've answered all of the questions, and we are almost at the hour. Do you have any other thoughts, anything that you wanted to say that that we didn't touch on yet?
Well, it's going to be an interesting session. Certainly ARPA is going to take a lot of air out of the room and will command a lot of time. If the hearings are anywhere close to what we had in the LR, 50 or 60 folks showing up with individual bills, it's going to be a process for the Appropriations Committee, and that's okay. That's what our job is. We're going to be as responsive and responsible as we possibly can with those dollars, as well as the excess dollars in the general fund. Distilling out and continuing to work numbers will be my proposition to make sure that we understand stimulus and its effect on the budget and what it looks like in year 3, 4, 5 as we move down the road. So state of Nebraska is in good position right now with the unemployment rate, has lots of job openings, but inflation is out there, and we got to assess what that means on state services. So lots of things, lots of challenges like normal.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Senator Stinner, and for pulling those numbers together for us. I really appreciate your leadership. I'm sure, I suspect that in January of 2023, you will be happy to not be waking up at, what was it, 3, 4 in the morning?
3 in the
that you
morning, yeah.
to put the budget together, but we're very grateful to you, and thank you so much for being here today as well.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us.